Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me stick with Mr. Ditch for a minute, and let me thank all of our witnesses for testifying today. So, I tried to catalog the various categories of spending that Congress has done over the last year. You alluded to that as well, Mr. Ditch. And if you add the extraordinary payments through COVID relief bills to the ordinary funding, I think the figure over the last 12 months is about $82 billion. I have a question for you. I wonder if you happen to have these figures handy. Do you have an estimate of the aggregate total for the entire country, the entire United States of America? Do we know approximately what the fare revenue loss was last year due to COVID and due to the very significant decline in ridership? Do we know how much money was lost in fare revenue?
I would estimate somewhere between 14 and $15 billion in revenue losses, and that would include things like fares, concessions, advertising, and the like.
So from basically all categories. So that's not just fare revenue, that's all sources of revenue. So what we sent them was what, 6, 7 times all lost revenue? Is that about right?
Closer to, I believe, about 4 to 5, but yes.
Okay, so 4 or 5 times all the lost revenue. Let me ask you this: back in 2010, the New York State Comptroller did a report and found that, and I quote, the MTA, New York's MTA, that is, the MTA has not effectively managed and controlled its overtime costs. No real efforts were made to make significant changes in longstanding practices that resulted in routine and often unnecessary overtime. In 2019, a report by a law firm that was hired by the MTA to investigate this issue came to the conclusion that, and I quote, this critical finding remains equally true almost 10 years later. So that's a pretty clear example. I'm sure there are others of a fiscal mismanagement. In your view, when Congress comes in and replaces, say, 4 or 5 times all lost revenue for transit systems, does that encourage the kind of reforms they need to be on a solvent basis going forward?
It really doesn't. There is a real lack of accountability when there are subsidies, and especially the further removed the subsidies are from the recipient. So, for example, there's a substantial amount of transit subsidy that takes place within metro areas themselves, but there's accountability. If the systems aren't run well, the citizens in those areas are going to let their elected officials know. But when there's federal subsidies, oftentimes coming from people who are living hundreds or thousands of miles away, for whom transit use is something that never crosses their mind, there's no accountability. There is no pressure for these transit agencies to use their funds wisely and to, for example, prioritize increasing service over increasing compensation.
Thank you. I'm going to run out of time here. So let me just ask a quick question of Mr. Feigenbaum. There's 2 dynamics that I want to raise, and maybe you could touch on both of them. One is this idea that I think there's a very broad view that there's a pretty significant chance that there will be an ongoing tendency for some people to work from home, and that the effect of that is that ridership on our transit systems are maybe unlikely to ever reclaim the level they were at pre-pandemic. Exceeding that is very questionable in many places. Is that an argument for focusing on maintaining the existing system rather than expanding and hoping that demand emerges? That's question number 1. And question number 2, if we do, if systems do choose to expand into, say, an affluent suburb, is it reasonable to ask affluent people in the suburb to pay the cost of their ridership?
Sure. So those are great questions. The first one, I would say it's absolutely true that transit ridership is unlikely to recover to the level pre-pandemic. Depending on who you ask, it's between about 70% and 90%, and that can make a significant financial difference to some of these transit systems. And so focusing on repairing and maintenance and operations is critical, especially when we consider that many of these systems have some maintenance problems and breakdowns to begin with. And yeah, I think it's absolutely true that if we want to expand service to transit choice riders, commuter rail, for example, it's absolutely fair to ask those folks to pay for it. I actually have no objections to that. I think if we are willing to cover 100% of the costs of the transit systems, that's great. I just don't think federal taxpayers should be subsidizing the cost of these systems.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks.